everybody else that you encounter the rest of the day. We have attitudes. We have an attitude problem a lot of times. And we can pick on kids for just having an attitude, but you and I easily have attitudes. Well, instead what we do is, if I encounter somebody who has a bad attitude, I'm saying, okay, I'm just not going to talk to them the rest of the day. I'm just going to avoid them. I just really don't want anything to do with them at that point because I know how mad they are about life. But these are some important words to live by, what Pastor Chuck Swindoll says. 10% what happens to us, 90% of how we then react to it. And I think that since God knew that I wrote these words down for my sermon today, he was like, I'm going to test you. I'm going to put you to the test today. What can I make go wrong for you today? And it worked. I was mad. I was so mad this morning. And some people were just coming up, and I don't even know who. So if this is you, I'm sorry. I blacked out this morning. And so people walked up and was like, hey, what's going on? Can I help? I can't talk right now. Right? One of those. You ever do that? I don't know who it was, so I apologize if that was you. But I'm just mad, had an attitude, so frustrated, so angry. And we all have those days where we wake up and we are just angry at everything else that we encounter. One time, this is kind of a gross story, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a disclaimer here. But sometimes when you just wake up and you're just on the wrong side of the bed, right? You just wake up and you don't even know why. When I was a kid, my brother and I shared bunk beds. I'm going to be honest, this is gross, but this is a true story. We shared bunk beds, and I always slept on the bottom bunk, he slept on the top bunk. And when I sleep, I'm like a mouth wide open sleeper. You know one of those? I don't know how many spiders I've eaten. I just, that's how I sleep. And so I was sleeping that way, obviously, because that's how I sleep, like I said. And my head, for whatever reason, was over the side of the bed. Like if the bunk bed is this way, you sleep here, my brother's up here, my head's here, that way, hanging off this side. And I snore. And my brother would get angry at me. And so he was like, Shane, be quiet, please. He couldn't get any sleep, just snoring super loud. And as he leaned over to yell at me, he all of a sudden became ill. Just puked. If you recall, I sleep with my mouth wide open over the side of the bed. Direct hit. And I slept through it. That's right. My brother didn't want to tell me that, so he literally went and got tissues and just wiped my mouth. And then went back to bed. And then I woke up and I was like, right? What? You just wake up, and I was in a bad mood, and I didn't know why. Just on the wrong side of the bed. Didn't know why I was upset, but I was upset, right? And then later, my brother told me, and I realized, that's why I was in a bad mood. So maybe you're in a bad mood because that happened to you. I don't know, your kid came over. I don't know what happened. So, but I remember waking up, I just had an attitude all day. And it was because of something I didn't realize, but I knew I just had an attitude.
I had an attitude problem. And I'm sure it didn't help when my dad came along. Like, hey, Shane, right? I'm sure it didn't help at that point. So I was frustrated. I was angry. And maybe you today, you have an attitude because of something that happened to you, or maybe you just decided you're going to have an attitude today. Maybe you just decided you're just in a bad mood. And then when it comes to church especially, you walk in, and sometimes we walk in and we just have an attitude when it comes to church. We're just like, I don't really want to be here today. I know if I'm not here, then somebody's going to call me or text me, or I know, or maybe you're here because your spouse made you come, or maybe you're here because your parents made you come, or maybe you're here because your kids made you come. That happens a lot, right? Like you wake up and you're like, I don't feel like going. And then your kid's like, hey, we're going to church today. And you're like, oh, fine. And they drag you to church. So maybe that's you today. And you walk into the cafeteria, sanctuary, whatever we want to call this room. You walk in, you sit down we start doing worship, and you're like, great, an acoustic Sunday. And now you're standing there, and then all of a sudden the screen, maybe you're sitting there, and you notice right away the words were like half off the screen. And you're like, they don't even know what they're doing. And so then you just have an attitude the whole time. You're like, I don't like this song. I don't like this. This sounds weird. I don't like the way Anthony's voice sounds. I don't like the keyboard. I don't like whatever, fill in the blank. And you have an attitude, and you get frustrated. And instead of standing there and worshiping, and instead of standing there and praying, and instead of standing there and talking to God, you're just mad, angry. That happens even to pastors. And we have to remind ourselves that it's not all about us. But your attitude when it comes to worship is important. Your attitude affects everything. Everything. And if we have a bad attitude, we are up the creek without a paddle then at that point. And it's hard for us to get back on track because we just want to feel what we feel. So how do we then worship when we have a bad attitude? How do we then worship when things didn't work the way that we wanted them to work that morning? Where do we go? What do we do? How do we handle it? So we're going to look in the book of Psalms, chapter 27. If you got your Bibles, you want to open it up. It's not on the screen, as you can understand, okay? But we have other points. But Psalm chapter 27, and our goal today is to figure out how can we have an attitude of worship. So I figured what better way to do that than to start with the man who was described as a man after God's own heart, which is David. David knew how to worship. If you don't know anything about David, David knew how to worship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about him. So David, when we talked a few weeks ago in our Walking Dead series, we talked about the verse in Psalm 23 where it says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, remember talking about that? That was also written by David. So now we're going to look at Psalm 27, which is a few chapters later. But the interesting thing about Psalms, we have to understand this, is that it's not necessarily a book that's in chronological order. Sometimes you read through a book in the Bible, and you're like, this is kind of confusing, right? Like, the book of Psalms is not meant to be a historical book. It's poetry, is what it is. So if you read the book of Psalms as if it's telling you a story in chronological order, you're going to be confused. Instead, we have to read it as the book of Psalms are songs, poems, writings that people put together, and it's not necessarily in a specific order. So in Psalm chapter 27, at this point, we don't know exactly when David wrote this. We don't know exactly when in his life it was written. Similar to Psalm 23, if you remember. A lot of people think that he wrote it when he was hiding from his son Absalom, if you remember us talking about that. But in Psalm 27, what people think, like I said, we don't know for sure, but what people think the time frame was for when David wrote this was right before he became king of Israel. Right before, and he had a lot of issues happening to him at that time. He had a lot of things going on in his life, and he's about to take on a really big role. And at this point, right before he became king of Israel, he lost his parents. He lost people close to him. So he's going through some difficult times. He's struggling with some things. Other people think that this may have happened later in life when Israel was delivered from a battle that they were in. So we don't know exactly where it was, but I do know this. The life of David had high highs and low lows, had ups and downs throughout his entire life. I mean, think of Goliath, think of Bathsheba, think of his son Absalom, think of going to war with all these different countries. I mean, it was just constant throughout his life. So in Psalm 27, verses 1 through 5, it says this. This is from David. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my stronghold, is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evil men advanced against me to devour my flesh, when my enemies and my foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. Verse 4, one thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. For in the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his tabernacle and set me high upon a rock. So throughout his life, David dealt with more than we could ever imagine. He dealt with a lot of crazy stuff. And I would imagine that if I were David, I probably would have had a different attitude a lot of times. Maybe frustrated, maybe mad at myself for some of the mistakes that David made, angry at whatever. It's not hard for us to find something to be angry about, is it? It's easy. Anybody can find something to be upset about. Whether it's directly in your life, in somebody else's life, in the news, or whatever. We can all find something to be upset about. So how then does David still maintain an attitude of worship in the midst of good times and in the midst of bad times? How did he manage it? How did he accomplish that? We're going to look at two things. First thing is this. David understands worship is a discipline. Worship is a discipline. We talked about a few weeks ago how a lot of times we just want to do what we feel. And if that's the case, we won't always worship because I don't always feel like worshiping and you don't always feel like worshiping. Instead, probably what happens is we come in and whatever we feel like doing is what we're going to do. David recognized worship isn't a feeling, just like love isn't a feeling. It's a discipline. He says right there in verse 3, though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then will I be confident. I mean, how do you have that sort of an attitude? When your enemies are attacking, when everybody is out to get you, how then did David still remain confident? Because he realized worship was a discipline. See, in today's day and age, there are plenty of things fighting for your attention. Plenty of things. There's so many things that want to get your attention, that want you to look at that, to pay attention to this, to put your money into that, to spend your time here. There are so many things fighting for your attention. But David refused to be consumed with anything other than God. David refused to be consumed with himself being king, and instead was consumed with pursuing the real king. That was David's attitude. He said, I'm not going to focus on me. I'm not going to focus on what is the easiest thing, the best thing, the most fun thing for me. Instead, I'm focusing on God at all times. And his single-minded pursuit of God is what made him such a successful leader. Single-minded pursuit. See, his pursuit also wasn't the opinions of the rest of the kingdom or the rest of the nation. He took into consideration opinions. But if you go through life trying to please everybody that you encounter, you're going to be exhausted and you're going to have an attitude problem because you're going to be mad. You're going to be constantly beat down. You're going to be constantly frustrated. If we are only going through life seeking the attention of others or the approval of others, we're in trouble. But David said, I'm not consumed with that. I'm consumed with God. And I'm willing to put everything else to the side so I could have a single-minded pursuit of Jesus Christ, of God. That's hard to do. Extremely hard to do. He was committed to having an attitude of worship, and because of that then commitment, it changed the scope of Israel and the scope of the world forever because of his passion. See, David was able to defeat Goliath when Goliath was way bigger, way stronger, and had way better stuff. He was able to defeat him. Why? Because Goliath was arrogant. Because Goliath thought that he was better than everybody else. Because Goliath thought that nobody could ever defeat him. Because Goliath thought that he would be on top of the world forever. And then along comes little 14-year-old shepherd boy David with no armor and a slingshot. Why was David able to defeat Goliath? Why was he able to have confidence when his enemies were attacking him? Because he knew that with God, all things are possible. And he was committed to the discipline of worship. He was committed to the discipline of pursuing God at all times. When we get to the point where we're so proud and arrogant and we think that we're good to go and we think that our life is all figured out and nothing, we're going to stay on top of the hill forever and all those sort of things, Pride is a first step before the fall, and Goliath found that out the hard way. And a lot of celebrities in Hollywood right now are finding that out the hard way. If you know anything about what's going on in the news and all the sexual harassment that's happening with all these celebrities, what happened? It's people in power abusing their power to put other people down. And when we do that, God says, I'll show you. I'll show you. That's exactly what happened with Goliath, and that's exactly what can happen to you and I if we think that we are the reason that we're so successful. David understood that, and he said, I'm going to be committed to the discipline of worship. But this